With all the moderate voices out of the picture, there are only two ways this conflict can now go. The Chinese can drive the British from their shores and clamp back down on trade with the outside world, or the British can bring this great empire to its knees and force them to trade on their terms. There could be no other resolution. When the Chinese emperor dismissed Qishan, he summoned 3 men to replace him and take over the efforts against the British. One was his nephew, who would serve as the main commander. The other 2 were officials and military men. Before they left, one of the officials recommended that they accept peace and let the British busy themselves with trade while they modernized and strengthened the Chinese army. But the emperor would hear of no such thing. They would take back what had been lost. Chinese forces now massed around Canton. Elliot was still there. He had been trying, with almost no success, to limit the opium that flowed into the now British-controlled port. And the same official who had tried to reason with the emperor now reached out to him, hoping that the large numbers of fresh Chinese troops he brought in would give him more leverage at the bargaining table, and perhaps get Elliot to agree to an even better deal than he'd already offered. But this would not be the case, and so Elliot started concentrating British forces, telling the British and American merchants in Canton to withdraw. By the 22nd of May, 1841, the Chinese were shelling the British factories in town. In the night, they launched fireships across the river at the becalmed British forces. The great steamship Nemesis fired up its engines, powering out of harm's way. The fireships missed the rest of the fleet, sailing past and slamming into the port, setting the town on fire. A gun battle took place, but by dawn, the river was firmly in the hands of the British, and the fort guns the Chinese held were silenced. Now it was the British's turn to go on the offensive, but that offensive was halted by a Chinese plea for a truce. 2 days later, though, one of the Chinese commanders decided to break the truce. Desperation had set in. They launched manned fireships to try to destroy the British fleet, but even this would not avail them. In the end, the Chinese paid an indemnity to the British to not sack Canton, but riots by the peasants, looting by both the British and Chinese armies, and the complete lack of resolution on the matters of the opium, trade, and Hong Kong issues meant further conflict was inevitable. But as the British withdrew to regroup at Hong Kong, a typhoon hit. The cutter Elliot was on was smashed, leaving him swimming with the flotsam. He began swimming hard for Hong Kong when, over the horizon, he saw a sail. It wasn't a British sail, it was the battened sail of a Chinese war junk. He knew he had to swim for his life. Hong Kong was right in front of him. All he had to do was make it. Exhausted, he dragged himself onto the shore, only to be greeted by the news that, actually, he was fired. He'd been fired 4 months ago. It was 1841, getting news halfway around the world still took a while. And the men who replaced Elliot were far less open to finding common ground with the Chinese. They were here to expand the rights of the British Empire by any means necessary. The war would no longer be interrupted by truces, ceasefires, and talks of peace. And thus the British began on their campaign north and east, capturing fortresses on their way. Each fortress wasn't just a victory in its own right, but a threat to the emperor in Beijing. Each fallen citadel was another jumping-off point that the British now held, ever closer to the Chinese capital. And this time, there would be no returning land. There would be no giving back territory unless all British demands were met. These islands and fortresses the British captured would be held hostage, not to be relinquished as a sign of good faith or as a part of an agreement to reach a peace, but only in exchange for the ransom the government back in England demanded. As they took these fortresses, though, the British found a strange thing. Everywhere they went, next to the cannon, in the guard towers, they would find opium pipes. The Chinese resistance was weakened by the very drug they were supposed to be fighting against. From the officers all the way down to the enlisted men, much of the army was addicted to the drug. The British forces, on the other hand, were a mixture of discipline and severity. The new British commanders saw themselves as the civilized force in the conflict, and forbade looting on the pain of death, and even prevented their soldiers from cutting off captured prisoners' queues for trophies. But when one of their soldiers was kidnapped and beaten during a resupply mission, they had no problem burning several of the nearby villages in retaliation, as if they could train the population through punishment. As the winter of 1841 to 1842 passed into spring, and Chinese attacks became even more desperate, the retaliations simply became more brutal. But their advance pressed on. By the middle of June, Shanghai was taken, and then in July, Xinjiang, where we get a prelude of what's to come with the Manchu commander turning on the Chinese populace, illustrating the cultural and racial divides that would tear China apart over the next 60 years. After securing Xinjiang, the British finally moved on to Nanking. Both sides knew this would be the final showdown. The British wouldn't have to seize the capital at Beijing because Nanking stood at the entrance to the Yangtze, the river which was the heart of China. It was the superhighway down which all trade to the capital flowed. If Chinese access to the Yangtze could be cut off, the capital would starve, and much of the kingdom would be in chaos. So it all came down to this. It all came down to the capture of Nanking. But there would be no great showdown, no final battle, because the emperor finally began to realize that he was beaten, and that if they lost Nanking, there would be no negotiation, only surrender. So better to negotiate while he still could. He sent an official down to talk to the British. At first, talks went nowhere, as the British demanded that the official be given authority to make binding deals for his government, the lack of which the court in Beijing had taken advantage of in prior negotiations to get out of treaties made by other officials. Cultural misunderstandings and attempts to delay as long as possible by the Chinese officials delayed the process slightly further, but by the middle of August, under imminent threat of attack on the city, negotiations commenced. In the end, though, despite technically holding Nanking, it was clear who had all the leverage, whose gunboats could impose their will if negotiations failed, and the Chinese ended up conceding on nearly every point. The 6 million that Elliot had asked for now became 21 million, and the amount was granted. A number of new ports for trade were opened up. The old Kohong monopoly was abolished, and tariff rates were to be agreed upon rather than set by the sovereign Chinese government. The island of Hong Kong was ceded in perpetuity to the British, and British subjects would operate there under British law, completely free from Chinese jurisdiction, and British consulates were established at the treaty ports. The only two things that the Chinese didn't concede on were Christian missionaries, which were such a touchy subject that not even the British delegation tried to bring them up, and opium. The Chinese government refused to legalize opium, even though the British representatives tried to lean on them to do so. Even though they had no power to prevent its sale, they steadfastly refused to legalize the drug. This would eventually lead directly to the Second Opium War, a conflict which plays out shockingly similarly to the first, at least in the broad strokes, but this time with most of the major colonial powers involved. These two wars, and the treaties which follow them, will go down in Chinese history as the unequal treaties, and begin what will later be labeled by the communist government as the Century of Humiliation. While at the time they may have seemed just a part of a larger destabilization and realignment of the country as a whole, they have since been seared into the Chinese consciousness, and to this day are conjured whenever dealings with the West take a turn for the worse. They are used as a milestone, a measuring marker for how far the country has come in the last 150 years, and as propaganda to remind everybody of that fact. And while these wars have perhaps the lowest casualty count of any of the conflicts that extra history has covered to date, they have had a profound impact on global politics and global understanding all the way to today. The Opium Wars are long over, but their effects linger in significant ways. See you next time.